Round 3 of the Superbet Chess Classic has just finished and it did not disappoint. So the game between Levon Aronian with white and Alireza Firouzja with black was absolutely insane, so back and forth and real drama. So let's see what happened here. Levon kicked off with pawn to c4 and Alireza went c6. And Levon then went knight f3, pawn d5, and so we actually steer this back into a Slav defense after pawn d4, knight f6 from Alireza. Levon went knight c3, and Alireza plays the main line here. He captures on c4. So a4 now from Levon. He clamps on that b5 move. We had bishop to f5, all very main line, standard theory. And now the knight came into e5 here. White wants to recapture that pawn with the knight. This knight developed to d7. The knight picked up here. And now the queen came out to c7. Kind of looks Caro-Kann-esque in the structure. But after pawn g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, the pawn doesn't go on e6 here. It immediately strikes at the centre. Pawn e5, good move. White captures here. The knight recaptures. And now the bishop comes to f4. It pins that knight to the queen, so you don't have time to pick up this unprotected knight on c4. This one dropped back to d7, defending the other. The bishop developed to g2, and now this is the first interesting moment. As you can imagine, there's many moves here for black, but Alireza went with one of the most aggressive moves. This was actually coined by Alexander Morozevich, pawn g5. So a really excellent move. You kick at that bishop and you're trying to distract it basically, because if the bishop captures that pawn, then you've left this pin here and now you just lose a whole piece on c4. So you can't actually capture that pawn. So knight e3 is the standard response. You hit the undefended bishop on f5, and if that bishop goes somewhere, say bishop e6, well now your knight's not hanging, so you can simply pick up a free pawn. So the standard way to play here, which Alireza did, is capture the bishop on f4. White recaptures on f5. And now Alireza goes queenside, castling the king. So already an exciting position on the board. Now queen c2 is the main move here. You step away from the d-file. Black's just brought that rook there. And here's where Alireza went down a sideline. So the main move for black here is actually knight to c5. A very logical move, because you open up this D line for the rook, and now white doesn't have time to actually capture that pawn on f4, because now you can go knight c4, you open up the queen to attack this pawn, and white doesn't have time to defend with e3, or then this rook's coming down. That's a monster rook lift. You're hitting this b2 pawn, knight d3 check is coming. The whole thing is just collapsing for white. So this is the main way to play, knight c5, then white doesn't capture the pawn, you have something like castles, game goes on. But what Alireza did here was go king to b8. And this is slightly different because now white can capture the pawn. Levon took up the challenge here, and after the knight comes to c4, you do have time to go pawn e3, protecting your pawn from that queen's attack. And now although black goes knight c5, they're just one tempo short, they're not yet landing the rook on d2, so white's got time to go rook d1, challenge the file, so black chops off here, the knight recaptured, Alireza went queen a5 check. Now this has been seen before, but here in every one of those games, white went knight c3, holds this pawn here, game goes on, usually black goes queen b6 there, targeting the b2 pawn. Black is a pawn down, but has compensation to cover for that pawn. But what Levon did here was not play knight c3, he just blitzed out king e2. Alireza was blitzing out all of his moves, so maybe he was trying to catch up on the clock. Afterwards in the post-match interview, he said he thought he remembered this from some analysis he did a while back. He thought this was just the main move. So he blitzes out king e2 and then suddenly realises, oh crap, this is not a good move. Because Alireza goes queen a6. Now he took about 20 minutes on this because he sat there thinking, wait, this shouldn't be good. I go queen a6. I've got all of these discovered attacks. I mean, look at the king staggering around the middle. It hasn't yet castled. You know, what is white actually doing here? And Levon's actually forced to go king f3 because if you come king e1, I mean, not only does it look dodgy on that square, but it's actually bad for a very concrete tactical reason. You can take this a4 pawn. It looks like you're running into pawn b3, forking the knights, but the key thing is when that knight left c5, it opened up this bishop, and now you give this deadly check. Forces the king back to a light square, then you've got all the discoveries again. None of this is working. So you can't step the king back. It had to come to f3. That was forced. And now Alireza finds absolutely the right way to proceed here. If you start going rook g8 or going for some attacking stuff, it's just not so good. So he just snaps off this pawn on a4, and he basically forces Levon to recapture. Now Levon said that he had planned to go queen to c3 in this position, then bring the queen out here, sit it on f6, but this is actually just no good at all, because now you can go rook g8, you save the rook, you're attacking around the king, and Levon wanted to go queen f6, pressure this pawn, everything like that, but then knight e6 is just killing it. Because if you capture with the queen here, can you see the way for black to proceed? Just kills the position. And if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button and let me know, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss a future video. So the killing move here is the awesome knight to e5 check. Now queen and king are forked, so you'd have to take that one, but now it's mate, queen g4, that's mate on the board, awesome variation. So the white king is just getting ripped to shreds here if you keep the queens on. So that's why in this position here, Levon had to capture, but he took 1 hour to play that move. And most of the time he was just kicking himself, cursing, not happy with what he'd done. I mean, cursing in his head, not out loud, of course. So the knight recaptures here. Now you're hitting that b pawn twice, and here's the trick. If you go pawn b3, forking the knights, then you've got knight d2 check. You're picking up the pawn, so that's why white can't actually play pawn b3, and this one's just simply caving in. Now the best chance for white here was to actually come knight to d4 here, because then after the pawn gets captured, if black did this, you don't have to, the knight recaptures, knight takes, rook b1, and the key difference here is that when the knight retreats, now you can take here with check, that one's pinned, and so on. So white's actually doing okay in this position, but black wouldn't have been forced to take on b2. After knight d4, you can play a different move like rook to g8 to keep an advantage. So knight d4 was best, but Levon was rattled. He went king e2, so it comes away from those checking ideas on d2, but now Alireza simply snaps off here, and he's got 3 connected passed pawns on the queen side. This is the big problem now in the position. Even though Levon's only a pawn down, these are just monstrous. So this one captured on b2, the knight recaptured, rook b1, and here's the big difference. After knight a4, you don't have time to play bishop takes on c6 using that pin, because then the knight lands on c3. This is a monster check, you pick up a whole rook. So that's why king d2 was played, covers that checking square. And now Alireza dropped his knight back, he covers that b file from the tactics, and Levon went bishop to f3, comes away from that g file, and Alireza just developed his bishop here to c5. But in these last couple of moves, you know, he's spent some tempos now just developing those pieces. He's not actually managed to get his queenside pawns going yet. And so Levon picks up a very small amount of counterplay. He goes knight h6, targeting the f7 pawn. Now he said at this point he knew it must be lost, but even so, he's just generating something here. Because after pawn f6, rook g1, we can see that this one's now coming down. Then you can try and win this h-pawn, either with bishop or knight, and possibly in dreamland, get your own h-pawn going. So don't go anywhere, because this game gets insane. So okay, we had pawn a5 from Alireza. He starts pushing his one. Rook g8 check, swaps off these rooks, the knight recaptures, now f6 is hit. So Alireza goes f5, he saves that one. Levon goes king c2, he starts to bring the king over towards the queen side, also steps away from knight c4 checks. Now pawn a4 played, the knight came to h6, it hits this f5 pawn, and knight c4 from Alireza. Excellent move, clears the way for the B pawn, and also now you're threatening to run the A pawn, so you don't have time to take here, for example, because then pawn A3. And this one's just going through, because if you go king B1 or king B3, then there's this devastating check on D2, you pick up the bishop. So you can't let this pawn come to A3 here, you don't have time to take on F5. So that's why bishop E2 was played, hits the knight, it hopped back into D6, now it holds the F5 pawn, bishop D3 attacked it again, and knight E4 by Alireza, a good move, and it looks like you can just take here as white, then the knight's loose, which you can do, but it's just not so great after knight takes on F2. The best move now would actually be bishop to E2, and again you've just got this problem that king C7, pawn B5 is coming really fast. This knight covers E4, this one's going nowhere very fast, the bishop covers F8, etc. So this is just really bad for white, there's no counter chances there really to speak of. So Levon didn't take on F5, he snapped off that knight, the pawn recaptured, and then he went knight to G8. Now you could start with king C7 here, this was an option for Alireza, then you cover this checking square from the knight. Alireza started with pawn B5, now knight F6 from Levon, and you're threatening to check, pick up the undefended bishop, so king C7 is forced, but now of course you drop this pawn on H7. In some of the other lines, if you start with king C7 before B5, then you can get H6 in. Don't want to go too deep on this stuff, but just nuanced steps. But Alireza is still winning this position. These are monstrous connected pawns, space invaders as Peter Svidler and Yasser Serwan described them. You know, really deadly, should be deciding the game. So pawn B4 played. The knight now came to G4, hits E4 here. Now already king B6 was really the best move here. Just start bringing that king in to shepherd down the pawns. Instead, pawn B3 check was played. Now you obviously push the pawns to light squares. You want to leave your dark squared bishop to roam on those dark squares. So the king came to B2. Now bishop B4. Again, you start cutting different directions from the king. You also free the C pawn at a later point. And now Levon took on E4. And here Alireza made a terrible blunder. Now it's not exactly obvious, but the best move here is to go king b6 for the key reason that now if h4 is played, you start running that one down. Well, you can go king b5, pawn h5, king c4, pawn h6, and now you get this a3 check move in. The king is holding this pawn, and these black pawns are just going through basically. It's game over. Equally coming back here, after king to b6, if you try knight c3 targeting this pawn, well then you can go king a5, you defend that one. Again, this should be winning for black. So king b6 was the move. What Alireza did was pawn to c5, but suddenly white has this knight c3 move. Now you're hitting this a pawn, that's indefensible. If you go pawn a3 check, well white's just taking here, it's no good. So actually giving up bishop for knight is forced in this position. The king recaptured, pawn c4, and this seems to be what Alireza underestimated from afar. So he perhaps thought that this pawn endgame was winning, but actually it should technically be drawn now. Having said that, that's a technicality. This is real humans. The time's ticking down. This game's still got a lot of way to go. So we had king b2. That's a vital move. You can't let black get a3. The king came to d6, and now pawn f5 is forced. If you go pawn h4 here, well then the king starts marching into c5. It's way too quick to then support the pawns. So pawn f5 played. Now this same march is no good because the pawn comes down here and it's going to be queening on f8 with check. That's the problem for black. So you don't have time to march the king into the queen side. It came into e5 here. And now again, a very important move from Levon. Black wants king e4, king d3. Then again, these pawns are too fast. So f3 is critical. You have to keep that king out. Now the king picked up the f5 pawn. h4 from Levon. And now all Alireza can do is wait here. So he goes king e5. You could also go king f6 there or other different moves. But he can't start marching over to the queen side. The white pawns chop him out. So pawn h5 played. Now he comes back, and again, only one move here to save the position. If, for example, you run this one, well, now the king comes back, it gobbles up that pawn, something like this, pawn e4, and black's actually going to eat these pawns here. This is no good, completely lost endgame, something like this. So you can't carry on running that h-pawn in this position here. f4 is forced, and now Alireza has his way in. So he abandons Levon's pawns, he comes king e4, really precise play by both players here, pawn h6, king d3, pawn h7, pawn c3 check, and this is now the point. The king has to go away, this one's coming through, and both players are actually making queens in this position. Alireza does it with a check, Levon picks up on a4 here, pawn b2, and this is where white now still has to be very careful because that pawn is one step away from queening. So Levon checked from h7, the king took on e3, he checked again, and although Alireza's eating all his pawns here, now Levon's got a completely open board to start checking, and this is what he duly does. The king gets given the runaround, he checks from h3 now, king e5, queen h5 check, now it came into d6, queen g6 check, so Levon just keeps checking here, it runs all the way around the board, eventually comes to b6, and now this is a really nice finish. Can you see the stalemating finish here? So Levon snaps off on b2 with check, gives his whole queen, but this is a draw, stalemate on the board, always really pretty when they finish like this, so that's how the game ended. If you enjoyed this game and want to see another classic clash between these two players, click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.